Good morning. Hello. How is everyone today? Tired? No. Okay, we have energy. Maybe a little bit. We'll pick it back up. So I hope you all enjoyed last night's dinner. And yesterday was a truly rich day filled with dialogue, learning, and inspiration. So together we explored the future of evidence-informed policy making in Africa through the vision of committed leaders, the power of training and mentorship to make capacity building programs more equitable, responsive, and inclusive, the central role of youth at the heart of future systems and collaboration, innovative approaches and tools for managing data and evidence shared through training sessions and showcases, the different uses of data and evidence across Africa in government, intermediary organizations, and research institutions. And finally, the lesson learned from national health experiences, as well as the perspective opened by artificial intelligence and the creation of African data and evidence infrastructure. Thank you all for the energy and insight you brought to these discussions. So this morning, we continue that momentum. Our first session takes us beyond national borders, exploring how regional processes in the transmission of evidence across scales can strengthen decision-making and collaboration across Africa. The theme of this session is regional evidentiary processes and the transmission of evidence across scales. To chair this important conversation, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Jessica Espey. So Dr. Jessica Espey is Associate Professor in the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences at the University of Southampton and is Deputy Director, Research for World Pop. Her research focuses on governance and epistemology, specifically how data and diverse forms of evidence shape the international governance of sustainable development and climate change. She has studied evidence use in a broad range of multilateral institutions, including the UN General Assembly, UNFCCC, and Montreal Protocol. Most recently, her research has focused on the role of regional economic communities in supporting evidence-informed policy development. When Jessica isn't doing EIPD research, she is promoting data use through World Pop, which works with governments to promote high-quality research methods for the construction of open and high-resolution geospatial data on population distribution, demographics, and dynamics. Jessica was formerly New York Director of the UNSDSN, Director of a global data governance network called Trends, and before that was an advisor to the President of Liberia during the SDG negotiations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Espey under your warm applause.
Bonjour tout le monde, merci beaucoup. Désolée, mais je parle en anglais parce que mon français est très mal. So I will speak in English now. I apologize. I stopped learning French when I was 15, and you can tell. So it is a pleasure to be here today with you all. Thank you so much to the African Evidence Network and ASED and colleagues for convening this wonderful event. I thought the dancing last night was incredible. I can't imagine my children having that much energy. And I'm still feeling full from dinner, so I think that is a very good sign of a wonderful and warm event, so thank you. So today we're going to talk about evidence processes at the regional level, specifically within regional economic communities, and talk a little bit about some research I did with colleagues, some in this room, like Frejus, but some of my other colleagues are not able to be here today, so I will speak on their behalf. So who am I? I asked ChatGPT to come up with a picture of me, and this is what it produced. I'm slightly offended, but maybe you think it's accurate, I don't know. I hope it shows the limitations of artificial intelligence. So I am a very ardent multilateralist. I love multilateral systems and processes. But having worked for nearly 15 years in and with the United Nations, I was feeling quite disillusioned. I'd been running a New York network, a science network, set up by the UN Secretary General's office, and I just felt that the way in which scientific and academic actors were engaging with the UN was messy. It was chaotic, it was ad hoc, and in spite of some attempts at improving the process, it was still a system rooted in 1945 and British legal governance, and it felt a bit wrong. So I left and I switched to academia late in life, and since I've been studying evidence use in multilateral systems, looking at the UN General Assembly, the Montreal Protocol on ozone protection, and so on. Very fortunately, about 4 years ago, I was introduced to Frejus from ASED, colleagues from South Sudan and Uganda, called Samahi Research, and colleagues at the University of Cape Town working on urban policy. And together we started looking at some different studies of how evidence was being used in their respective contexts. And we're trying to rectify what I think was a real problem, which is that a lot of the academic literature that we read and that we use and that we synthesize is from the global north, particularly in this field, in policy studies and evidence-informed policymaking. And I'd been asked to advise the UN General Assembly on some reforms, and I was looking for literature, and everything I was finding was from Germany and England and France and Australia. And I was like, come on, I know there are some amazing people working on this. So we set out to try and document their experiences, their practices, their work, and try and get some more of that into the academic literature. And as anyone who works in academia knows, publishing is slow, but we are working on it and have lots of papers coming out soon. And our interest was both in rectifying this gap in the academic literature, but also, more importantly, in studying evidence transmission, both to national government, but also national to regional governments, and so on up the chain. So next slide. So most recently, in the last 18 months, we've been studying regional evidence-informed policymaking processes. I just realized I didn't put my timer on. There we go. And we've been looking at the practices of the African Union and the regional economic communities across Africa, of which there are many. So we just took a sample. We've looked at 3 case studies specifically, which I'll talk about in a minute, and 3 regional economic communities, trying to figure out how they're using evidence in those processes and how we can help strengthen it. The context for this is that in 2024, the UN General Assembly, in the Summit for the Future, emphasized the huge importance of the regional economic communities. As we can all tell, the international system is creaking, and that is a very polite way of putting it, right? Multilateralism is in trouble. The General Assembly is struggling to govern many of the world's most pressing challenges. And in that context, more and more attention is being put on regional governance as potentially the fora in which we can keep progress moving, we can maintain our sustainable development commitments, and so on. And so, personally, I was very interested, and colleagues were very interested in what is the role of the regional economic communities in pushing forward global policy agendas and regional policy agendas, and how do they do it? Also, it's interesting to note that in 2014, the African Union's STISA, the Science, Technology, Innovation Strategy for Africa, also talked about strengthening science capacity across the continent and also the crucial role of the regional economic communities in doing that. And they talked and talked and talked about how these should be nodes for knowledge and synthesis of evidence. That was 11 years ago. And still we see a lot of political interest, but questions about how effective practices actually are. And so that's some of the context. And we really felt like we as a group, as a consortium, felt like this was an understudied area where we could potentially look at what's happening, how it can be strengthened, but also it's a really interesting level because it's like a mediating level between global policy agendas, the big commitments of Paris and the climate agreements and the SDGs and the new urban agenda, and what's actually on the realities of local contextual concerns and how they meet. So that was our background. Moving on. Next slide, please. Okay. So what do we know? So even a brief review of the literature today shows us what everyone in this room knows very well. There has been a rapid growth across African regions of institutions supporting evidence-informed policymaking and evidence synthesis. One study suggested that from 2008, there were 31 organizations across the continent that talked about doing evidence synthesis, and as of 2019, there are 521, and I expect, based on all of you here and many of the wonderful youth leaders, there are now many more than that. And as I said, there is a lot of political interest. So with that context, we tried to think about, well, what are the different types of actors working across the continent on evidence-informed policymaking? And we categorized them into 5 areas. You've got the intergovernmental platforms, so the African Union or the regional economic commissions, where they are proactively supporting evidence synthesis, or when they are. You've got independent academic networks, like the African Academy of Sciences. You've got UN-affiliated knowledge platforms, like the WHO's EVPNet, which you might be familiar with. Think tanks and NGOs working on this. I think you're all here. Give me a whoop. And then you've got private sector consultancies, like the PwCs, the Dalbergs, but also groups like LSE's International Growth Center, which are increasingly doing this sort of private consulting in this space. Next slide, please. But even again, a cursory review of the literature suggests that whilst there's more entities, more interest, more excitement, there are persistent challenges. Firstly, the ongoing problem, the old chestnut of politics versus evidence, and the fact that policies are often only loosely influenced by evidentiary inputs. Second is huge sectoral disparities, and you can observe even from a review of literature and practice and policy documents that the health sector is incredibly well represented in this space, whereas other sectors are incredibly underrepresented. Geographic concentration. We did a very preliminary review of who the most significant actors were in this space and found very strong dominance of a few institutions, mainly coming from South Africa, Egypt, and Uganda. So universities and think tanks rooted in those places really sort of, at least in the last 10 years, dominating this field. So suggesting that whilst it's making progress, it's still not really representative of the broader continent. Many networks are hyper-specialized, so they work just on health, or just on agriculture, or just on WASH, and there isn't that much cross-sectoral collaboration, of course exempting many of you in this room. And a personal concern, long concern, has been and persistent problem, which I will come back to, is weak connections between academics and think tanks and universities and national statistical offices. So this fracture between kind of quantitative data and academic practice. So those were some of the challenges. I'm being told to slow down. Sorry, translators. Those were some of the challenges that we identified just in our initial review. But if you move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. We decided that we should dig into this a bit further. We should try and understand with a bit more detail and nuance what's really happening in different regional institutions. And so our study explored how evidence flows between national and regional level. And we discussed lots of complicated ways of framing this, what questions we could ask, what methodologies we could use. And ultimately, we just came back to a pretty simple political economy analysis, right? Which is like, who is involved? Who are the actors? What are they doing? So what evidence are they using? What is being presented, in what formats to these different processes, and how is the evidence being mobilized? So how is it being circulated and communicated? So those were the sort of general overarching questions of our research. Next slide, please. Thanks. Now, I'm an academic, so I would be remiss if I didn't say that there was some theoretical basis for this work, but I won't spend too long on it because you might fall asleep. So we looked a lot at policy studies literature, of course, evidence-informed policymaking, but also some great literature on policy transfer theory from the likes of Diane Stone. If you don't know her, she's a wonderful academic, formerly at the European University, which studies how policies are transferred across scales. And we thought, well, this has got to be pretty similar to evidence, right? And then we looked a lot at the governance literature, so things around polycentric governance arrangements. Some of you might know Eleanor Ostrom, very famous academic in this space. I really recommend reading her work. And we were looking at what aspects from all these different theories seem relevant here in evidence-informed policymaking. Okay, let's jump on, please. So we decided to focus on 3 case studies. The 3 are partly a reflection of the fact we didn't have a huge amount of money. I would have loved to have done 50. And also the nature of the partners' expertise. So we did a health sector study looking at NEPACOA, which hopefully many of you are familiar with. Another one looking at agricultural policy and ECOWAS, and specifically ECOWAP, which is the agricultural policy. The urban sector, and specifically looking at the AU's Urban Policy Forum, which happened in 2024, and the influence of academics across the East African community. We use key informant interviews, focus group discussions, all that kind of thing. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to run through these case studies, but it should really not be me presenting them because pretty 99% of the work here was done by my colleagues. So the first colleague who led the study of health policy is Aisha Ali from Samahi. She's based in Uganda and has worked a lot in South Sudan and is a fearless advocate for evidence-informed policymaking. She's currently doing a PhD at Oxford and is very busy writing. So I'm going to represent her findings. She specifically looked at how health policy was being formed in the NEPACOA platform. And NEPACOA is a parliamentary body trying to devise health policy recommendations and to synthesize evidence in health policy. The mandate to do this comes from NEPAD and from the AU. And they've commissioned NEPACOA to basically work on synthesizing health evidence inputs. So there is a very strong institutional mandate there. There are annual meetings that bring together diverse evidence producers, and then parliamentarians serve as as the brokers, if you will, of this evidence, and they debate the policy implications of it. The major players, as I said, are NEPAD, PPDRO, who convenes the meetings, and then some of our wonderful partners here, like AFIDEP, who help facilitate, bring the meetings together, and so on, and help present the research. Next slide, please. That's a very good example of a very institutionalized process for soliciting evidence inputs to support the AU level and NEPACOA's health policy. And some of the quick findings, because it's a long study, are that national parliamentarians share best practices and tacit knowledge upwards. So they come together in this forum, they share their personal experiences, their own national evidence inputs, and that knowledge is really well sort of coalesced, synthesized upwards for the NEPACOA process and in turn to NEPAD. Regional evidence gains legitimacy through peer endorsement, and then it returns back. So a lot of parliamentarians we spoke to said that going to these forums and presenting their experiences and getting positive feedback enabled them to go back to their national context and say, hey, I presented this, people thought it was really good, so we should be shouting about this, right? One stakeholder said that NEPACOR is a good platform for cooperation and South-South peer collaboration, etc., etc. It's a platform for sharing best practices and collective advocacy. And one of the real success factors is that evidence is co-produced with national ministries, ensuring that it's really highly nationally relevant before it's presented regionally and then fed up the chain. So it's then the recommendations can be relevant when they come back down, if you will. Next slide. The next study, really Frejas should be presenting this. Frejas, do you want to take to the stage? He's a busy man. So it was led by Frejas and ASED colleagues and was on agriculture and agricultural policy within ECOWAS, specifically the ECOWAP process. And they found that the ECOWAP development was really facilitated by an international consulting consortium commissioned by SILS on behalf of the ECOWAS Secretariat. So they set up and commissioned a platform, a consulting platform, to facilitate evidentiary inputs to support the development of the agricultural policy. And there were three main types of evidence they were collecting: statistical data, codified knowledge, so reports, research, academic papers, but also tacit knowledge, so when people were coming and presenting and sharing their insights orally sometimes, and so on. But what this case study shows us is that the process was facilitated by a consultancy firm, right, or a series of consultancy firms, not by a standing institution. Next slide, please. So some of the findings, again, that evidence pathways were channeled through consulting firms who were acting as policy entrepreneurs, if you will, or policy brokers for that one specific process. The mechanisms they were using were sometimes very effective. Data compilation from national sources, they were synthesizing reports and studies and doing rapid synthesis, they were doing expert consultations. Many of those mechanisms can be highly effective. But critical limitations is that the process wasn't institutionalized, it was project-driven, right? It was funded for this one particular policy process. And so one of the big problems is that some of the recommendations they came out with, like the creation of a data mechanism called EcoAgris, which was meant to assimilate agricultural data from across the region, couldn't get funding and couldn't get institutional buy-in, and so it fizzled. Okay, next one, please. The third policy we looked at was the creation of the new urban policy in the African Union. It was led by a colleague called Anton Cartwright at the African Center for Cities, UCT. And it was really looking at, particularly in urban policy issues, which are fundamental, crucial, really essential for our understanding of modern sustainable development, but are often very underrepresented as an academic discipline, because urban science is only increasingly recognized as a sort of whole central legitimate discipline. There was actually a real problem in this space, right? That there was no institutional mechanism, there was not any existing knowledge platforms that they could really draw on, and there were very few centers of expertise across the continent, barring the likes of African Center for Cities, that they really felt that they could draw upon. The AU also were coming up with this policy, but only appointed one staff member in the whole African Union to work on this, whilst devising a brand new policy for the continent on sustainable urbanization. And there was no dedicated evidentiary infrastructure. They also brought in consultancies, Boston Consulting Group, PwC, not exactly African outfits, and had short-term funding from the African Development Bank. Next study, please. Next page, please. So what we can see from this is, really it was a very different process, right? You have an AU-led and internationally encouraged policy agenda, and then they are trying to retrofit sort of evidence, but without a mechanism, with only one person, and with very limited capacity. And what Anton was looking at is there's a brilliant think tank that was established in Tanzania called the Tanzania Urbanization Laboratory that had been working on continental issues of urbanization for a decade before this process came on board. And how did they engage with the AU? What opportunities were they given to provide inputs, and so on? And he basically found that on the whole, their local inputs, their local knowledge, was considered difficult to interpret compared to the international reports, and was ultimately highly contingent on individual standings. So he recites this anecdote of being at the forum when they're trying to finalize the declaration, And one of the AU ministers comes to him and says, hey, we don't really know what to say. Can you just call this guy from UCT? And so they just call this guy from UCT, one of these eminent professors, and he just gives them some language. They shove it in, and away they go. So it came from an academic, came from someone grounded in science, but entirely ad hoc and dependent on individual relationships. So those are the three cases that we looked at. They're not exactly representative, right? They're different sectors, different areas of the continent. But they're a start in us trying to understand what are the different ways in which evidence is being curated by these regional institutions. So if we jump on. Next slide. Thank you. So we then came back together as a team with the colleagues at Southampton and Bristol, as well as all of the colleagues who'd done the individual studies, to look at, well, what does this tell us? What is comparative across these cases? And what does this help us understand about the way evidentiary practices are happening within the regional economic communities and the African Union currently? And just a few common observations. So firstly, there is huge sectoral variation. The health sector is really quite well mobilized because of a long legacy of large investment, particularly from the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, Malaria, WHO, Gavi, which has supported and enabled a lot of knowledge translation platforms to emerge in the health sector over the last particularly 20 years. Other sectors like agriculture, there is a lot of domestic expertise. You have amazing academics and scientists and think tanks working on agricultural policy, but really moderate institutional arrangements to try and facilitate and solicit that input. And in urban, you heard what I just said, severely underdeveloped. There are also huge sustainability challenges. A lot of people were consulted and engaged with these policies, and then after the consultation, they walked away, right? What are your views on X? And you give them your views, and then you leave. They don't care how it evolves, how it works, because there's no mechanism through which they can give their ongoing input. Another thing that we found is that the political mandates are crucial. So for NEPACOA, having a mandate from the African Union and from NEPAD was hugely important for them being able to bring stakeholders together and come up with something that was seen as representative and legitimate, and that they could take back to their national context to say, look, we agreed this in a NEPAD process, let's talk about it here. In the other sectors, without that mandate, it's incredibly hard to then communicate your findings again. The other thing is that I think resonates well with everyone in this room is that we saw, and we didn't preempt this actually just came out of the research, that transnational actors like AFIDEP or ASED or others are hugely important in facilitating these dialogues, in bringing people together, in helping digest and synthesize the evidence, and brokering the process. But also another thing, and this is a personal issue that I've struggled with for a long time in this space, is the need to really provide some slightly more nuanced categories of the evidence we're talking about, right? Even in the UN, you'll be standing in the UN General Assembly, people come in and they're like, we're now going to hear from 5 different stakeholders, one of whom is an individual child giving you their testimony on what is happening in their community because of climate change. And the other one is an academic who has been studying climate change for 50 years and has done longitudinal studies. Those evidence inputs are not the same, right? One is incredibly powerful, the other one is quite technical, but they are not representative of the same scales, and that is often glossed over. We need to be really clear about the kinds of evidence inputs we're talking about and what they represent. Ooh, can I have the slides back? Next one, please. So what were the types of evidence that we saw? So a lot of codified knowledge, expert reports, synthesized academic inputs, and having mechanisms like what we heard yesterday, rapid synthesis processes are incredibly helpful for that. A lot of statistical information from NSOs, particularly, as well as multilateral agencies, was used in all of these processes. A lot of tacit knowledge, so oral testimonies and experience accounts. But one of the things that we saw, and as I mentioned before, is again this complete gap between the information being provided by the national statistical offices and the information being provided by the academics. Because of often policy and legislative requirements, NSOs provide their data, often quite raw data, direct to the ministries or policy or groups that are engaging on a given process. And without that intermediary, that academic or think tank having the time to analyze and understand and interpret the data, is often very hard for the policymaker to actually know what to do with the NSO's raw data or to have the time. And so one of the things that we saw is that we really need stronger collaboration between statistical agencies and the analysts, right? To have time to provide input before it's shared with these political processes. Next slide, please. On the how, the mechanisms vary wildly by sector. Again, as we saw, very institutionalized within the health sector, project-based within agriculture, and ultimately internationally driven in the urban space. And that is something that is a reflection of history, of money, of resourcing, but I think we can see some really strong practices within the field of health that could be replicated or adapted for other sectors. But as I said, a key thing that we observed is that we started assuming that evidence would go from a national university to the national government to the regional process. They would debate, and that would be it. That is not what it worked, how it worked at all. It's like a mess of people providing inputs and then looking at it and then reflecting and then going back to the ministry, and then it's going round and round in this very non-linear format. And I think it's important that we think about that when we're talking about evidence-informed policymaking, that actually across scales of governance, it's very dynamic. Okay, next slide, please. Obviously, for all of these cases, there were funding and capacity issues, and that is something we can see in all the literature, right? That regional entities often possess the mandates, but they lack operational capacity. And in the case of the NEPA-COA example, what was good is that NEPA had recognized their own limited capacity and mandated NEPA-COA to facilitate the evidence synthesis and the parliamentarians to help them, which means both win. Because when these processes are left under NEPAD, who have limited resources and capacity, but ultimately have the mandate from the African Union to convene science and support science uptake at the regional level, it often doesn't happen, right? Another thing, of course, is donor dependency. That's an old argument, so I probably don't need to talk too much about that. But one thing that we did see is that different funders were funding different networks and different processes, and sometimes that was undermining the regional authority. So you might have the African Union saying, okay, we want to engage with this entity and we're going to support them to facilitate it, but then a donor would come in and fund another think tank or group or whatever without a mandate, and then it all gets very confusing. So this sense of the fact that actually we all need to be aligning behind the political system, essentially, in spite of its inadequacies, is really important. As I've alluded to, we saw a lot of money being spent on consultancies. I mean, this is a whole separate field of inquiry and has been written about a lot. But with these individual policy processes like the ECOWAP process, money was being spent on international consultancies like Boston Consulting Group, right? Which is madness. We've got incredibly strong academics working in these fields across the continent, but because they can't be reactive or responsive or immediately provide turnaround, it's often going to consultancies, which is something that we as a community need to figure out how to fix. Of course, on fundraising, the exception, as I said, is probably to some degree in the health sector, where a lot of regional CSOs have been quite successful in mobilizing funding through development connections. How are we doing time-wise? Okay, great. So we just jump on. Thank you. Yeah, I won't spend time on the theoretical contributions, but obviously as we've tried to write this up, we've been thinking about what are we saying that is new, that's going to add to this field of policy and governance studies. And here are just a few of our observations from this initial preliminary research. I think the key thing really is that the existing ideas about policy transfer are very relevant, but they're not fully appropriate. It's very different in the evidence space where you've got NSOs with very strong, national legislative obligations and mandates and formats, and academics that might have similar conditions. And those standards and technical infrastructures really influence how evidence is presented, which is not a problem you see so much in the more conceptual policy space. Next slide, please. And then ultimately, we sort of tried to take a step back and think about, well, what are the policy recommendations of all of this? I think the clear one is obviously the benefits of institutionalized mechanisms, right? Whether your institutions are particularly effective or not, having a clear mandate and having a process mandated through that entity from the African Union really makes a big difference to support these regional economic commission processes and to give them legitimacy to then influence domestic policies. As I've already said, the importance of strengthening domestic capacities and trying to find ways to support think tanks and universities to do reactive work instead of consultancy groups. As I've already mentioned, the importance of looking at the parameters that facilitate NSO and academic collaboration. So NSO being National Statistical Offices. Because we really have to find ways that academics can have first access to and do analysis of raw national data and support the policy-making understanding of that data before it gets shared, before it gets directly inputted to a policy process with minimal impact. And we have to find ways of ensuring that stakeholders continue to engage, not just when they're initially consulted on a given policy, but throughout the life cycle of the policy. Next slide, please. And then a few more points. I think really just the thing here is the knowledge translation platforms in the health sector have been incredibly successful on certain different domains. We can't replicate that. They're a legacy of a lot of the funding that was originally swashing in about 10 years ago. But we can look at adapting these practices to other sectors and trying to encourage the regional economic commissions to learn from those processes and potentially look at replicating them. And then I've already talked about the regional mandates and the last point, which is around really valuing but also disaggregating evidence types, right? When you're talking to policymakers, be clear, is this input come from a systematic review or has it come from a personal testimonial? Has it come from a longitudinal study over 25 years or has it come from a 3-month analysis, right? They're very different and the weight we give to these different evidentiary inputs should be according, right? So that is a huge concern. Okay, my last slide is just conclusions, but I think you've probably all fallen asleep by that point, so I'm going to stop. What I would love is just to really hear from all of you. This is very much an early inception project. We just started looking at the role of these regional economic communities. What we would all like to do in conversations with Frejus and other colleagues, I hope many of you in this room, is look at this much more systematically across the whole continent and also look at it with reference to other regions. I've been working very closely with ECLAC in Latin America and looking at what are they doing, what are their practices, etc. Also the European Commission. And so what can we learn about effective evidence mobilization at these regional scales in different continents around the world, and what can we replicate? I think as we can see from the NEPACOR example, there are some spectacular examples to learn from here that we can share with other continents and vice versa. So that's really what we'd be eager to do as a next phase of work. But what I would love now is if anyone in this room has worked with your regional economic community, the African Union, if you have personal experiences of the process, how it worked, your engagement, I would love to hear from you or any reflections you might have. So maybe rather than questions and answers, I'm happy to answer questions, but really just reflections from any and all of you would be amazing. So thank you so much. I will stop there. Great, so does anyone have questions or thoughts? The floor is open. Great. You happy to pass the microphone? There's a lady in the middle, a gentleman here, and then 3 that way. As I said, these don't have to be questions, just reflections are great too. Put your hands up again, please.
Good morning, Jess. Thank you so much for that presentation. My name is Jennifer, speaking from the University of Oxford. I was really keen to hear from you on how you think about weighting different types of evidence, as you were talking about the heterogeneity and evidence sources. So you have, a longitudinal study, you said, of like 10 years, and then you have someone giving the experiential account. So on one hand, totally agree on like weighting different types of evidence sources, and even to the point of like the difference between causal and descriptive studies even being weighted the same way, that's also a challenge. Yeah. But then on the other hand, I think we can also start to think of it as a form of epistemicide, as like devaluing different types of evidence. So do you have a sense of how you're thinking about how this weighting should happen? Yeah. How are you thinking about it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I've got a quick answer. I used to talk about weighting, and now I've moved on because you can't. It's so subjective. I think all we can do is be really transparent about methodologies. So when you're engaging with a policymaker as a knowledge broker, tell them, has this come from a 10-year study or is this a really powerful personal testimonial? And maybe for them, a child talking about their experiences of flooding is going to be far more influential than the IPCC report. Like, it depends on the individual, right? But I think we just need to be clear, because it's unfair to be pitting these forms of evidence against each other. Yeah, sorry. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Can we please slow down while we're answering or asking questions to help the translators while they do the work to help everyone understand what we're sharing? Thank you.
Désolé, encore. Allez, translators.
Okay. Thank you very much for your great presentation and very interesting insights on some of the realities that we face. And I was just reflecting on some of the work that we are doing, which has to do with working with governments and then struggling to reach out, like, to the AU and other international government structures. Yeah. And the challenges that are there, they are real. But also looking at the challenges that we have as researchers to put together what we find in our randomized control trials, as you mentioned, and then maybe not a randomized control trial, but the surveys or the quantitative methods, the reports, and what somebody brings along as a lived experience, and the difference between the two. Now, I think we've been having a lot of conversations around this, or some discussions around this, and as researchers, we know that that's a problem. And it could actually be one of the reasons why maybe it's challenging for governments or some of the policymakers to understand us. And I think one thing we should think about doing is how can we make this lived experience the data that's coming out of there, be able to compete with what's coming out of our experimental or our non-experimental studies. So, for example, can we put together these lived experiences in a way that it can compete with the RCTs, for example? And also, I know that a well-conducted mixed methods, which includes an RCT, should be able to capture that, but there still are limitations. And I think these kind of discussions we should be able to boldly jump into and start asking ourselves, how do we go about it? Because I think it's a very complicated space that we may be afraid to go into as researchers, but that we need to go into. I know of cases like chloroquine resistance that I could actually blame on the fact that lived experiences were not considered, because the pruritus that comes with use of chloroquine in the treatment of malaria can only come from people's stories and how horrible it is, and what are the cultural implications of myself, scratching myself all over in a gathering, for example. And people stop completing the medication. Now, the research on that medication assumed that those who did not complete the medication could not be considered as part of the studies. But now, in real life, those people are part of the community, and because they stop, the resistance comes up. So we really need to start thinking about how can we do that, and that could be a whole discussion that we can pick up in the evidentiary space. Thank you.
I'll wait for a few more questions and then.
Merci. Le mien est plutôt une contribution, notamment dans le cadre de comment la volonté politique pourrait plus ou moins faciliter l'intégration de ces données-là. Je prends juste le cas au niveau de l'IEMOA. Il y a le réseau des think tanks de l'IEMOA, dont IPAR, l'institution dans laquelle je travaille, fait partie, donne mandat à des think tanks pour les aider dans le cadre de l'élaboration, mais aussi de la conception des politiques. Je prends juste un cas dans le cadre de l'assainissement, où ces think tanks-là ont eu à réaliser l'évaluation des politiques d'assainissement dans 5 pays d'Afrique de l'Ouest. L'idée était de changer un peu les politiques d'assainissement. Je prends l'exemple, par exemple, du Bénin et du Sénégal, où des think tanks de manière individuelle avaient plus ou moins pointé les insuffisances au niveau de ces politiques-là. Mais le plus souvent, ces évidences n'ont pas été utilisées de manière directe par les politiques. Mais lorsqu'il y a eu ce mandat à travers l'IEMOA et que les politiques ont été évaluées à travers ce réseau des think tanks qui a eu le mandat à travers de l'IEMOA, on a vu que ces évidences ont été utilisées dans différents de ces pays où auparavant, de manière individuelle, les think tanks n'ont pas pu le faire. Par exemple au Bénin, aujourd'hui, plutôt au Niger, où on a enclenché aujourd'hui la révision de la politique de l'assainissement. Au Sénégal aujourd'hui, à travers cette étude, la police de l'assainissement est en train de mettre en place, alors qu'auparavant, on a vu quand même de manière individuelle que des think tanks ont pu le faire. Donc c'est juste donner l'exemple de la forte valeur ajoutée de la volonté politique par rapport à l'intégration de ces données lorsqu'elles sont produites à travers un mandat clair qui a été donné et qui marque aussi comment la volonté politique pourrait aussi être un levier dans la production mais aussi dans l'intégration des données au niveau des politiques. Merci.
All right, thank you. This is Sketchups Atengle from Pax Africa, based in Accra, Ghana. Being an ecosystem support organization, if there's any way to validate the things that you've shared now, I think I would want to do that because from the experience that we have had across at least sub-Saharan Africa, we get to see almost everything that you're seeing. So this is interesting. Seeing someone from the global north seeing these as well. It tells how real these issues are on the continent. The challenge we've seen with the level of fragmentation that you're talking about is in how we address that. Who will lead this charge? Could the AEN, for instance, be positioned to do that? Are we capacitated enough to negotiate all these conversations? These are things that I think we should be thinking about going as an outcome from these engagements. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Can I maybe reply quickly to some of your comments before we move on? Is that okay? Firstly to the gentleman here, you were talking about, it's a thorny topic, figuring out how we reconcile different methodologies and their value, which is subjective, and how we use them. But you're right, I think we have to have this discussion, and it really started for me working at the General Assembly, where the number of times I helped, because I ran a science network, I helped organize panels, and then the president of the General Assembly would say, I want the premier from Tuvalu to present. And so he'd come and he'd give a really compelling presentation on his personal experience of coastal erosion and flooding and sea level rise. And then I'd have him sitting alongside Chris Stern, who'd be presenting the latest climate science. And I was like, they're equally valuable, absolutely, in their different ways. And personal testimony is huge, and stakeholder participation is vital. But we have to have a more serious conversation about what is representative and what is not. But of course, within that, you also can't just defer to the large-scale representative studies, because if they're purely quantitative, you're missing so many qualitative insights, as you shared with your great example of health practice. So I think it's two things. I think methodologically, academics need to think about how to maximize the policy utility of their research by using mixed methods, by making sure there's community engagement and stakeholder feedback. Fortunately, I do think COVID-19 and Ebola, for the tragedies that they were, did change practice in the medical field about using much more qualitative and community-based insights. So that is positive, but again, it only pertains to the health sector. But yes, this is so fundamental. And for all of the regional economic communities, the UN isn't doing this, the HQ isn't doing this, so let's do it at the regional level. Let's have meaningful conversations about how we're going to value and use and present different types of inputs. Thank you to the gentleman here who provided that great example about research that you had collected, I think, within the WASH sector, and also a really good example of how engaging with a regional process and the mandate conferred from that then enabled the research to be better taken up nationally. So it reaffirms legitimacy from some third entity, and only by all working together are we likely to actually get some commitment from these senior-most levels. Any more comments or reflections? I think there's 3 ladies in this row. Yeah, thank you. Oh, and a gentleman.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, hello. Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Veronica Osorio, and I'm part of the Hub Lab and also the Epicenter in UCL. Actually, I'm very pleased to hear your results because as part of my research, I've also done the same mapping in Latin America and Caribbean.
Great.
Yes, and it's interesting because sorry, slow. Okay, sorry. It's very interesting because I've had similar results, but adding to what everybody said, about the evidence, types of evidence, and the conceptualization of evidence, I wanted to remark and to know what you think of the role of the funders of the evidence, no? Because they practically define what kind of evidence will be developed in their sector and how much funding and how much of evidence we will have there. There are sectors, for example, I'm thinking about malaria that somebody mentioned, that there is funding, so there is more like a data system, more structured, so it's possible to do different kinds of analysis. But there are others that, thinking more in Latin America on human rights or indigenous rights that are more context specific, that require more qualitative research, we don't have funding. And so those sectors got neglected, and also the definition of evidence changes, no? And how we approach on evidence-informed policy making, how we define evidence platforms also change, and that creates this gap of a conversation between all the actors. No? Yeah, that's one reflection, and maybe we can talk later.
Yes, please. Thank you. We'll take the next couple of inputs and then come back. The lady here in the middle. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Jessica. That was refreshing and very insightful. To start off on a lighter note, I can say that AI really didn't. There was no ethical, responsible, and transparent use of AI in your picture.
A very good point.
Okay. But
Well noted.
On a more serious note, thank you for, I'm Zinit Ishmael, and I used to be the chair of our National Statistical Office in South Africa, was the chair of the strategy committee until 2019. So thank you for bringing the role in of the NSOs, and but they are powerful in itself in terms of the mandate, and they're grounded with the Statistical Act. Comes from history with data revolution and the lessons from the NDGs and the SDGs. Powerful in terms of the actors you mentioned, in terms of the evidence base, but here the high-level groups, the United Statistical Nations, the EU, for example, and that's and one can go on. But suffice to say, in such networks and the African Evidence Network, where is the presence of the NSS and the national statistical systems that is established within the boundaries of the geographical frames, but to do cross-collaboration. And cross-collaboration not only with other government departments, but other entities such as NGOs and so forth. And they have the power through the Statistical Act of coordination. So I'm not giving a question, I'm just kind of contributing to your insightful speech. But there are good collaboration happening in Africa across NSS, Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, and so forth. So your nuance on the evidence communities, and I think the further work in the coherence of the policy makers, if there are statistical releases, and how does the agriculture policy makers comes together, education policy makers come together, and have a coherence evidence for translation into government. well, then perhaps it could be less messy. The issue of standards, yes, and it's also grounded within the data quality assessment framework. In evaluation space in South Africa, the evaluation standards, it's established, not taken off. However, I hear you in terms of the weighting, but perhaps criteria or standards, what makes good quality evidence for policy translation. And perhaps that could help to make it less messy. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we had one more lady. Was it the lady in the blue, and then the gentleman here, and then I'll reflect. So these two. This lady in the blue. Yeah. Thank you.
Ok, merci. Bonjour à tous. Je suis Esther Yao de l'Agence nationale de la statistique, démographe de formation de Côte d'Ivoire. Vous avez abordé le déficit entre les informations fournies par les chercheurs et les instituts nationaux de statistique. Donc, ma préoccupation serait de savoir quelles mesures pourraient être prises de sorte à concilier les efforts de ces deux acteurs pour que les informations qu'ils fournissent puissent être orientées dans le même sens. Merci.
Merci.
Merci et bonjour à tous et à toutes. Je suis Issou Foureratou, je viens du Niger, donc de l'Observatoire national pour la promotion du genre. Merci pour toutes ces informations fournies, très pertinentes aussi. Mais j'ai une petite préoccupation par rapport aux savoirs locaux et les connaissances empiriques endogènes, qui souvent ne sont pas pris en compte même dans les politiques nationales. Et ça pose énormément de problèmes. Si je prends l'exemple de la pharmacopée traditionnelle africaine, qui a montré ses preuves dans le cadre de certains traitements de certaines maladies, et ça a fait beaucoup d'écho en Afrique, et ils ont étouffé ça. Pourquoi ils ont étouffé alors que ces connaissances empiriques doivent être prises en compte dans nos politiques publiques? Je pense que si nous voulons des données probantes et capables efficaces, fiables, et capables de nous donner des réponses à tous nos défis, il faut compter avec. Merci.
Merci. Oh, okay. We have. Do you want to do one more? Okay, one more question, and then I'll respond. Okay.
Ok. Merci.
Merci.
Alors, je suis Monique Enyakou. Je suis doctorante en biotechnologie à l'université Félix Houphouët-Boigny en Côte d'Ivoire. Alors, je tenais à vous dire merci pour votre présentation qui nous a permis vraiment d'avoir des éléments pertinents sur les données probantes. Toutefois, je requiers en fait votre avis en tant que dévancier dans la recherche. J'aimerais savoir si tout cet écosystème évoqué autour des données probantes, c'est-à-dire les difficultés, aussi bien les difficultés que les solutions et même les enjeux, pourrait avoir la capacité d'influencer la recherche future, précisément. Et si c'est le cas, quel pourrait être l'impact de cette modification? J'aimerais vraiment avoir votre avis sur ce point. Merci.
Merci. On the last question, just to clarify, so your question is, how can the how can regional platforms influence research agendas? Is that correct? Sorry, the translation was ambiguous. Thank you.
Effectivement, les plateformes peuvent être impliquées. En fait, je demandais si tout ce qui tournait autour de données probantes, de tout ce qui est évidence, pouvait avoir un impact sur la recherche future. Et donc, effectivement, il pourrait être inclus les plateformes. It's okay.
Okay. Yeah. Merci. Thank you so much. Firstly, wow, there is such a diversity of skills in this room and backgrounds. So thank you for your insights. Yeah, I think I will jump around. On the question that the lady at the front raised about indigenous knowledge, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's a reflection of a system or series of systems that are based on an old-fashioned model, right? Our regional economic community practices are to some degree shaped by the UN's mandate for regional economic commissions. And that itself is a historically rooted system. The UN architecture is based on a British governance parliamentary arrangement from the 1940s. And with all of that background comes, I think, the privileging of classical academic input. And whilst sometimes that is great, as we've been hearing today, I think there's an opportunity for us to do it very differently. I think there's an opportunity for the different African regional economic communities to change the way in which we solicit input and evidence, and to define their own categories of what is considered valuable information for synthesis. This comes back to this conversation about how you value and judge different forms of information. And I think it needs to be a local conversation. The West African community might have a very different view to SADC. So I think all of the regional economic commissions should have a nuanced conversation about this, about what forms of inputs are going to be valued within national and regional policymaking and how. And there is absolutely a role for that kind of indigenous knowledge and insight. We just have to figure out how to present it so that it is given the space it deserves. Concurrently, I would say there's also a mission for the academic community to study these processes and document them in the more accepted modes of academic communication, right? To better understand these practices, to do more qualitative and local quantitative analysis of them, so that we have an evidence base relating to this indigenous knowledge that we can use in these processes. So it's a two-way thing. Thank you for the great remarks on the National Statistical Office. I wholeheartedly agree. NSOs are so important. And when I am wearing my other hat, I work on demography, and I work very much with national statistical systems and offices, and they have excellent mandates, clear political connections, strong regulatory frameworks, all of which I think could be very beneficial to broader evidence actors to observe and learn from and understand the institutional arrangements which we should mimic in the broader community. But we also need to somehow figure out how to remove this barrier to cooperation, which is sometimes legislative. Sometimes the NSO has to report direct to the government and it cannot engage with third parties. In those cases, it might be appropriate for our national government to consider reviewing that, so that at least a sample of national institutions can access some of that preliminary data before and analyze it. So I think it's a complicated one, but it's, I think, a hugely important field of further study. To the lady who asked the question here about future research agendas, I think groups like this are going to be hugely important in working with the regional economic commissions and communities to understand what are the likely policy imperatives of the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, and feeding that back to academics and to universities. I think we have a tendency as evidence-informed policymakers to take our evidence background and communicate one way to the policy process, but we need to also feed back, right? What do the policymakers want? What do they need? What reactive requests are we getting? And to try and help particularly junior researchers be more responsive to that. It's sometimes harder for, you know, the old guard who have big funding commitments, teaching commitments, blah, blah, blah. But for early career academics, I think it's a real opportunity to show your skills and to dynamically react to policy questions. So maybe that is an opportunity for something like the youth group here to engage with different regional economic communities, find out what their priority concerns are, and try and craft your own research agendas relating to that. So yeah, a huge amount of opportunities. I don't know if we have time for any more, no, we have no more time for any more questions or reflections. But thank you so much to everyone for your great inputs. It's really great to hear from you. I am here and would love to talk to as many people as possible. I hope to continue working on these processes within the regional economic communities. I hope I can talk to my colleague from Latin America. And hope to look at it across different geographies. So I would love to hear more of your reflections. So thank you so much. Thank you also finally to Aisha, Ali, Freja Soto, and to Anton Cartwright, who were fundamental to all of this work. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Espey. Thank you to the audience as well for your question and your participation. So before we move on to the tea break, we are going to take a quick family picture. So I will ask everyone to please come to the stage, or please come forward. We will take that picture together. And then we can move to the tea break and continue with the sessions. And also, don't forget to leave the headsets on your chairs. Merci de laisser vos casques sur les chaises, s'il vous plaît. We already had a couple missing. We would like to keep the remaining here. Oui, après c'est les breakouts. Okay. So after the tea break, there will be the breakout sessions. So we are not coming here yet. La pause café se fera dans le restaurant à cause de la pluie. So the coffee break will be done in the restaurants because of the rain. Vous pouvez monter sur le podium. Some of you can come on the stage if you'd like. Please come forward. Merci de vous rapprocher, s'il vous plaît. Les hôtesses, vous pouvez nous aider, s'il vous plaît. Please, come up. Some of you may come up. If you want, you can stay down there. Vous pouvez monter ou rester en bas. Hello. Hello. Please, let's move to the... Okay. Let's get on the stage, please. We only have a few minutes before we move on to the coffee break. Veuillez monter sur le podium, s'il vous plaît. Il y a encore de la place. Exactly. The tall one's on top if you want. All right, come join us. Rejoignez-nous, s'il vous plaît. There's still some space on the podium, on the stage. Il y a de la place. Allez sur le podium. Il y a encore de la place. Il nous reste juste quelques minutes. Please, we only have a few minutes. There's still space on the stage, please. Okay. Only a few minutes before we move on to the tea break.